Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Juliet Kaarbo tonight for her inaugural lecture on the theme Leaders, Groups and Role-Playing, Agents in Foreign Policy and International Politics. I think we're in for a treat. Julie's focus is on how states make foreign policy decisions, and the way she looks at this is through human agency and social networks, which I'm sure places her in the middle of a very intense and disputed field in international relations. So we're going to hear about examples from Turkey, the Netherlands, Japan, Germany, Israel, the US, the UK, and indeed Scotland. So I'm looking forward to that greatly. A pleasure to welcome you all here, and especially the family here in the front row. Great to see Ryan, Quinn and Ellie's friend Miro as well. I know we've got colleagues from elsewhere, St Andrews, Stirling and perhaps others in the audience too, so you're very welcome this evening. Julie came to us from the University of Kansas in 2011 to a senior lectureship here, and was promoted to her professorship in foreign policy in 2015. And Julie's got one of these really interesting CVs, the CV of an all-rounder. She writes textbooks, and that's such an activity which has become discouraged by the incentives that we face as academics. We have been actively discouraged by the ref to write things which are primarily intended for students and to support students in their learning. And I think that's really regrettable. And I'm really pleased that Julie is kind of bucking the trend and writing also for students. Turning to the research side of her work, I'm just looking at this list of publications. It's got an extraordinary hit list of all the top journals in international relations, which are all very hard to get into, and it's a very long list. European Journal of International Relations, International Studies Review, International Studies Quarterly, Cooperation Conflict, Foreign Policy Analysis, and quite a lot more, which says a lot, I think, about the standing of Julie's work in her discipline. As I said, Julie came here in 2011, not perhaps imagining that she would then become quite deeply involved in thinking about the possibilities of Scottish independence, and Julie's expertise in foreign policy analysis became expertise that was demanded by both sides of the independence debate in thinking through the foreign policy implications of that debate, and indeed what dimensions the foreign policy of an independent Scotland might have had the Scottish electorate voted in a different way. And it was fantastic to see a new arrival just jumping straight into to this very specific Scottish debate. And then, of course, you could say the same about Brexit, which has all sorts of foreign policy implications and which has seen Julie again take her expertise outside of the academy. And that's what I mean by roundedness, that commitment to students, that outstanding research quality, and this activity in taking the insights from research into very live and very sensitive debates. And I think this was all recognised in a very appropriate way a couple of weeks ago at the International Studies Association conference, which is the kind of global convention of people working in Julie's field, where Julie was distinguished as the distinguished scholar in foreign policy analysis of the most important conference in the world in her field. And that says a little bit about, I think, what we're going to hear tonight. And I'm looking forward very much to it, and would like to invite Julie to come up here and tell us about leaders, groups and role-playing.
Thank you. Thank you, Terry. Thanks, Ross. find my notes here. Everybody can hear me? Thank you. Thank you, Charlie, for the kind words. And thank you all for coming here tonight. I'm honored and humbled that you would spend this evening with me, listening to me talk for about 45 minutes. I'm going to start with a story. And apologies to those who have heard it before, but it's one of my best. And I promise just to give the brief version. I was in the United Kingdom for a political science conference, and I was flying home from London back to where I was, to my family in Kansas. The problem was that the day was the 11th of September, 2001. So US airspace was closed, and we circled around for a while. We'd been flying for about 6 hours anyway. So we were allowed to go through across the Atlantic, circling around for a while. The pilot told us that there was a threat to a terrorist threat in the US, and that's why airspace was closed, and that's why we were about to land in Gander, Newfoundland. Clearly he knew more at the time, but that's all he wanted to share with us when we were still in the air. So we landed, so I'm in one of these planes. 30 or more jumbo jets landed within 30 minutes coming in from Europe towards the United States, and they landed at Gander, Newfoundland because it's a NATO Air Force base. There was a suspicion that there were still terrorists out there somewhere, so they put NATO bombers in front and in back of us, dropped our bags on the tarmac. Bomb-sniffing dogs came out to look for any problems. There were more than 7,000 crew and passengers on those planes. And they kept us there because of the potential terrorist threat, and there was really no place to put us. Gander itself only has 10,000 people that live there. So they kept us there for more than a day. So I was on the plane for more than 30 hours. Watched 5 viewings of Bridget Jones' Diary, because you only got the one movie in the back of the seat back in 2001. And that's not a good movie the first time, but believe me, 5 viewings, it gets worse. It got very cold. There was no food. Eventually in the morning they brought us chocolate bars and potato crisps. Allowed off the plane the next day, and I'm one of the first US citizens registered with the International Red Cross as a refugee from an attack on the homeland. And Walmart brought us toothbrushes and underwear. And our plane was kept together and bussed out to a little town called Gambo, which is a lovely town on the water. And that's where I slept on the floor for several more nights, slept on the floor of a church, and kissed the fish at a local tavern. And that's not a euphemism. I mean, maybe, but it's not mine, but it's an actual fish. It's an actual drink and then fish tradition. So I tell the story because it's a good story. It's intrinsically good. And whenever my teaching is feeling like it's slowing down, losing student interest, I pull out my 9/11 story and tell the story. I tell it because it's also an important event of our time. 9/11 was a horrifying, shocking, watershed event for international politics, and much of my research in the last 15 years has been about foreign policies towards the Afghanistan conflict, towards the conflict in Iraq, and other consequences of 9/11. But I experienced some of the best of humanity on that day, and there is a Broadway musical, haven't seen it yet, called Come From Away, that is about when the plane people came to town in Newfoundland. And I think it involves fish. And the theme of the musical is about humanity and about the strangers that were helping strangers that week in Newfoundland. And did you know that the person, the agent who closed US airspace that day, it was his first day on the job. His supervisor was home ill, and so it was up to him alone to make this unprecedented decision and keep me there. Right? So this story also shows the interconnection between the professional and the personal. This would not be the first or the last time that my professional travel had implications for me personally. But I also tell the story today because telling stories is important, and that's how I wanted to approach this lecture tonight. I think it's part of our life, the story we tell our kids about how we met, the story we tell our kids about what they were like when they were young, the stories of adventure, of challenge, of joys. I've come to believe that telling stories and making stories is a very valuable part of life. And we tell stories in our research and when we teach. Some of the best articles, books, teaching is in narrative form with plots and twists and puzzles and good conclusions. So today I'm privileged to tell a story about my research. Not so exciting, but this is what got me here today. And my research, along with teaching and the other parts of my job, is very near and dear to my heart. It's what I do. It's what I practice on almost a daily basis. So it is personal. And it is a privilege to share this with you. So here's the customary baby picture. Not quite a baby. I was 3 years old at the time. So I hope this appearance goes a little easier for me than that first public appearance. I was a flower girl for a basketball queen ceremony at the high school. There is such a thing as basketball queen ceremonies. And this was when I was growing up in a small town in Kansas, in liberal Kansas. And liberal is a misnomer, believe me. And I had to walk down the basketball court in the dark with this little boy I didn't really know. And there were flashbulbs going off, and I was scared, and I think I was promised chocolate if I would just get through it. So today I'm a little nervous, but a lot less nervous then, because I do have a story to tell, and my story has a theme, and that is agents, especially individuals as agents. Just like the air traffic controller, this is Ben Sliney, who closed U.S. airspace on 9/11. So agents, agency, and their connections is my focus. And this is a two-pronged theme. Agents and agency has been the focus of my research and my teaching, so I will talk about the importance of individuals and agents in foreign policy and international politics. But the second part of the theme is just as important. It involves the individuals, the agents that I have worked with. In my opinion, it takes a village to raise an inaugural lecture. So I will, along the way, include in my story some of my co-authors. I'm lucky enough to have many, and many, many really good ones. So I will start with individuals and end with them, but in between, move through small groups, coalitions, parties, parliaments, and end up at national roles. And this is just a brief overview. It's trying to give you some of the main arguments, some of the main findings. If you're interested, you can ask me at the reception or book an appointment with me or just read the research. So all of my research is tied to the idea that human subjectivity and domestic politics are important to understanding international relations. And this is not the normal way of thinking about international politics. Traditionally, historically, international relations has focused on big international structures, big systemic pressures, and certainly not individual leaders and their personalities. So I don't make it a big habit of quoting Henry Kissinger, not a big fan, but I do like a quote that he says, and I've used this in my own research, and it was after he became part of the Nixon administration. He said, "As a professor, I tended to think of history as run by imperial forces, but when you see it in practice, you see the differences personalities make." So I study leader personality, but not US presidents. That's the most common way within this field, and certainly the current US president cries out for a personality profile. And I also don't study authoritarian leaders who arguably have the most power of leaders to be able to influence their foreign policy and put their personal stamp on their foreign policies. I kind of chose a harder case to look at the importance of personalities by looking at prime ministers. And so in my early work, I tried to take on an institutionalist view of prime ministers as very constrained and conditioned by different types of political systems, parliamentary systems that they were in. This view gives little room for agency for prime ministers and sees their personality as idiosyncratic or impossible to study. Right? So I tried to take on this view, and in my early work, compared leaders within this similar system. So I did a very light touch leadership style profile analysis of Adenauer and Kohl in the German system, and Margaret Thatcher and John Major in the UK system. And I did this using standard categories of leadership styles, so not idiosyncrasies, but personality types and categories that have been used to study US presidents. I adapted those to the study of prime ministers. And I found a couple, I think. I found that prime ministers do vary a lot in the way they go about their business and interact with others, and what they believe and their personality, and that these differences matter. So I showed how they affected levels of cabinet conflict, turnover in cabinets, who won in cabinet conflicts, and eventually policy choices, including foreign policy choices. More recently, I've been looking at how prime ministers' personality affects their orientation to parliaments. Usually it's a choice of whether you're going to involve parliament, especially on a security issue. It's often ambiguous and vague, parliament's role. So I argue that prime ministers have a lot of choice in this matter, and even when they don't, what they are like, their personality, influences their orientation to parliament. So it influences whether they go to parliament in the first place, it influences how they handle the vote, and how effective they are at it. My recent work on personality uses a framework called the Leadership Trait Analysis Framework, which provides concepts and methods through a quantitative content analysis computer program that uses spontaneous remarks of leaders and codes them to generate profiles of leaders and capture their political or their public personality on these 7 individual characteristics. This framework has been used by many, other than myself, on many leaders and on many decisions. And this research has shown consistently and reliably that these traits are associated with the levels of conflict leaders pursue in their foreign policy, how leaders go about making decisions, how they structure their advisory systems, and so much more. Right? There are more than 300 profiles of world leaders, and along with Ryan Beasley from St. Andrews and Mark Schaefer from the University of Central Florida, we're now working to try to get all these profiles together in a single publicly available place and set up a system to offer real-time profiling as new leaders come onto the scene. Leadership Trait Analysis was created by Margaret Herman, and she is a big part of my story. This is Peg Herman. She was one of my PhD advisors. She's been my mentor and supporter throughout my career. She introduced me to all the important people in my field. We were a co-author on early research, and I'm pleased to have her writing with me again, although she's late with her bit of the chapter just now. Peg got her PhD at Northwestern in 1965, and she got her PhD in clinical psychology. But at that time, all PhD students were required to take just as many graduate seminars in a discipline outside their home discipline, and Peg chose political science, and that has had a huge impact. She's generated generations of political psychologists. She was one of the founders of the International Society for Political Psychology. And then she was even the president of International Studies Association, a very political science, especially at the time, kind of organization. And she was one of the only women in international relations, studying international relations, when I started my career. So she was a big role model for that. When I was in graduate school, Peg secured a large National Science Foundation research training grant, and I was one of the first fellows in that grant. In that grant, Peg created what we called an invisible college. So the grant was on cognition and collective decision-making. And Peg recruited the top 12 political scientists working in that area and the top 12 psychologists working in that area. And they came together 3 times a year, I think. And each of us who were fellows had a mentor in each discipline, and we were able to rely on the whole Invisible College to support us in our doctoral work and beyond. How lucky was I? This grant lasted 5 years, supporting over 30 fellows, many of whom I still work today. My work on leaders is also focused on Turkey. So with my co-authors, we've coded 6 Turkish leaders, prime ministers, and presidents, 4 just pictured here. And we've looked at them in 18 different cases of Turkish foreign policy decisions. And with this, we can compare different leaders facing similar situations. So for example, we argue that Turkey faced similar situations in 1991 in the Gulf War and in 2003 in the Iraq War. In both situations, the US was pressuring with carrots and sticks Turkey to cooperate with them. In both situations, the leaders at the time, President Özal and Prime Minister Erdogan, favored cooperation with the United States, thought it was in Turkey's best interest to do so. The military was divided in both situations, the Turkish military was, and the public was largely opposed to cooperation. But these cases turned out very differently. In 1991, Turkey cooperated with the US, did what it said. In 2003, in a big surprise, it did not. And we argue that this is due in part to the big personality differences that we see with Özal, between Özal and Erdogan. And you can see it just in these pictures. Özal directed the whole parliamentary process about allowing cooperation, and Erdogan said, vote your conscience, and took himself out of the vote. I don't think he'd do that today, but that was his public personality and leadership style at the time. We also take advantage of the quasi-experimental design that Turkish politics offers, and we've compared all 4 of these leaders, so in addition to Özal and Erdogan, Demirel and Gül, who have served as both prime minister, so head of the parliament, this is the Turkish Grand National Assembly over here, and as president. And these are 2 very different institutional roles, and we wanted to see, does their public personality change when they change roles? And we found a couple things. One is that these 4 are very different people. Right? The profile that's generated shows that there's no single Turkish prime minister personality or no single presidential Turkish personality. We also showed that they didn't change much when they went from these one institutional role to another. Their personality traits were quite stable. These are my Turkish co-authors, so it's always good when you're working on a country and you don't know that much about it to find people that do, and this is my team that does. This is Benur Özgeci Taner, Esra Chuhadar, and Barış Keskin. Benur and Esra are also students of Margaret Herman, so they're my little sisters in a sense, in an academic sense. And Barış Keskin was a PhD student of mine. And people sometimes ask me, how can you write with 3 other people? But somehow it works for us. And it works outside the writing as well. Esra and Barış were very important to me and helped me out of a bad spot when I, with my family, was living in Turkey on a research fellowship in 2009. I crashed on a quad bike in the middle of rural Turkey. This is Cappadocia, beautiful area. I advise you to go. I advise you not to go on a quad bike. And Esra and Barış helped me get ambulances, get surgeons, and get hospital beds after I broke 7 ribs, my clavicle, and my ankle. And some of this help involved high-level Turkish political leaders in Ankara, in the capital, calling the leaders in the region in which I crashed. US State Department also got involved at one point. So leaders matter, even when you don't expect it, and even in some of the most personal circumstances. So that's leaders. Now on to groups. My earliest work was on small group decision-making, the politics and the psychology of it. This was my doctoral research that I began. Most foreign policy is made in small group settings, this we know. We also know from psychology that groups are more than the sum of their parts. Right? There's social dynamics involved in the context of small groups that affects individual and group level decisions and behavior. Okay? So most work on groups in foreign policy, especially at the time that I was getting my PhD, had been inspired by Irving Janis's work on groupthink, probably heard of that. Janice argued that and showed that excessive consensus seeking, conformity in groups, leads to poor decision making and to policy fiascos. Okay? Groupthink is consistent with early work in social psychology by Solomon Asch. And here's this graph is one version of the famous Asch conformity experiment. Right? So Asch brought subjects into the lab and said, ask them which line was longer. Right? So figure out in your own mind which line in the right-hand box is longer, A, B, or C. You have a reference point in the other box. But before they answered, Asch told his subjects that a majority of participants before them said line C is the longest line. Okay? And what did they do? Well, in the original Asch experiments, 39% of the people conformed to the majority, this invisible majority opinion, and agreed that line C was the longer line. In subsequent studies across many trials, some scholars reported 39%, or 57%, and one even 75% conformity to the wrong majority opinion. Janice and others showed that this can happen in political decision-making groups. Elites are also susceptible to conformity pressures. But I wasn't interested in conformity. I was interested in conflict in small groups because I was interested in parliamentary systems. And in most parliamentary systems, they're governed by multiple parties, by coalitions. And so you have the potential for built-in conflict. And I wanted to know what's the psychology behind that conflict of dissent and dissent in small decision-making groups. Okay. So lucky for me, there was work by Serge Moscovici, who's pictured here. Not one of my co-authors, but I did meet him once, and he read a chapter of mine, and he liked it. And I like his work, so he gets a picture. Moscovici was interested in social change, and he reasoned that if minorities conform to majorities, and there's such a power of conformity, then new ideas must have to come from minorities. So he started a whole research program on minority influence and the psychology of it. And he turned this around, Asch's study. This is called the Asch backward paradigm. He turned this around and told participants that a minority before you said line C is longer. From his experiments, we know that minorities can influence majorities, but not nearly as often. Only 8% of the time can a deviant minority get the majority to choose the correct answer. But it's still 8% of people, of you, saying that line C is longer after you've been told a minority believe that. We also know from Moscovici's work and those that followed in this tradition that the social influence behind dissent and deviance is different than the social influence with conformity. So when minorities conform to the majority's viewpoint, they comply. They say they agree, but they don't really agree. Right? They just do it because of social pressure. When minorities get majorities to change their opinion of which line is longer, rarer though it is, they're actually persuaded. Right? They actually believe it, or more likely to believe it. And we also know that minority influence is different than majority influence because the keys to minority influence are largely irrelevant for conformity and majority influence. So study after study from Moscovici showed that minorities need to be consistent in their argument. That's their best tool at getting the majority to change their mind. Consistency is irrelevant for conformity, for majorities trying to convince minorities. They can be all over the board in their argument, and the social pressure of conformity can still happen. And other studies have looked at minorities' normative effects and shown that exposure to dissent makes groups more creative in their thinking and decision-making. So diversity is good, even at a psychological level. So I borrowed from social psychology work on minority influence in my early research, and I looked at how junior coalition partners influence German and Israeli foreign policy. And I found out that they did, right? So even very small parties can influence at times a state's foreign policy. And the things that explained this influence were consistency, right? This was critical to junior party influence, but also if they were able to exploit divisions in the senior party, that helped them influence policy, and if they manipulated the decision-making context in a way that balanced against their size disadvantage. So I see coalitions as political groups, but also as small groups of agents susceptible to psychological dynamics, like conformity and minority influence. And I continued to use this perspective in a book I did a few years ago on Dutch, Japanese, and Turkish foreign policy. The Netherlands is always governed by coalitions. Japan was throughout the 90s, as was Turkey. And so I was just interested in what happens when there is conflict over foreign policy in these coalitions. How does it get resolved? Who wins and why? But also in this book, I wanted to look at the quality of the decision-making process. Right? That coalitions have a bad image inside and outside academia. But I found that they were not so deadlocked as is often assumed. Okay? And they can even produce creative decisions consistent with the ideas from minority influence research on creativity that is spawned from exposure to dissent. So those were all qualitative case studies that I did, 3 each on Germany and Israel, no, 4 each on Germany and Israel, 3 each on the other countries. But I wanted to supplement this with quantitative research, and that's work I did with Ryan Beasley. Right? We looked at a large quantitative data set of foreign policy events, more than 23,000 events we statistically analyzed. And we first had a basic question. Are coalition governments' foreign policies different than single-party governments? And we found that they were. And the main difference is that they were more extreme. So coalitions engaged in either more conflictual or more highly cooperative foreign policy behaviors, whereas single-party governments were more moderate in their foreign policy behaviors. Okay? So we followed this up with another study to try to get at why. And so we looked at different types of coalitions and their characteristics to try to find out try to unpack what's going on here that makes coalitions behave so differently. And we found a couple things. We found that the more parties there are in the coalition, the more likely they were to be extreme in their foreign policies. Kind of counterintuitive, because you'd think you'd have all those veto players in the coalition to prohibit extreme behaviors. But it is consistent with political science ideas of log rolling and with psychological ideas of group polarization and diffusion of responsibility. We also found that the weaker the coalition was in terms of its parliamentary control, the more extreme it was in its foreign policy. And again, there's political explanations. It could be diversion away from its fragility. But there's also psychological explanations that have to do with groupthink-like induced stress. So there's a lot more to do with coalitions, but they are the most common form of government within parliamentary democracies. They make important foreign policy decisions. And from my research, it's clear that they are different types of political units. My work on coalitions naturally led me to research on parliaments and parties. And so I've worked on 2 very similar cases of parliamentary influence in security policy. The 2003 Turkish vote on US forces and the 2013 UK House of Commons vote to not participate in military strikes against Syria. The first with Barış Keskin and the second with Dan Keneally. And in both these cases, a majority of parliamentarians said, no prime minister. It's one of my favorite titles of my articles. And they did so for very similar reasons. The leadership in both cases kind of bungled the vote. There was intra-party divisions in both of these cases. But in the UK case, there was also this issue of the ghost of Iraq, or the ghost of Tony Blair. And what we found, and what we argue in the article, is it wasn't so much what happened in Iraq, the war, but it was how the UK got into it. So parliamentarians used this as a lesson about how it needed to be very vigilant and not commit the state to any more military action without more intelligence and questioning of that intelligence. So I think the ghost of Tony Blair was probably on holiday last week. I've also been working with these people, Wolfgang Wagner, Anna Haran-Saras, and Falk Osterman, and we've been looking at why do MPs vote the way they do when they're allowed to vote on deployment. And we found, kind of unsurprisingly, that ideology matters. So leftist parties tend to vote against deployment, rightist parties tend to vote for it, support it. Not very surprising, but no one has really demonstrated this before, partly because parties and parliaments have been assumed to be not so important in foreign policy, especially security policy. So we now have collected data for 9 countries on military deployment votes and have made them publicly available on a website, Deployment Watch. And it's version 2, it's coming soon. There's 4 countries available now. So you might be asking me at this point, Julie, what does this have to do with agents and agency? Where'd your theme go? Okay. And it's a fair question, but I do have answers for that. Right? So looking at parliaments and parties and these big institutions of coalitions is still about agents and agencies. Right? Individuals play an important part of these collective groups. That's been a theme of my research. These collectives are agents themselves compared to the grand structures in much of international relations research. And finally, looking inside at these institutions and thinking about their agency helps us unpack the larger level, the state's agency, digs in deep to state agency in international relations. So this relates to another area of research for me on national roles and role theory. Right? Role theory is a perspective that uses the theater metaphor and sees states playing roles on the world stage. Roles are socially recognized categories, they're part of a role social system, and they are relational. You can't have a state playing the role of a leader without other states taking up the role of followers. My work on role theory first began with an invitation to a role theory workshop from Cameron Tees on the left and Marika Broining on the right. Cameron Tees is the next president of International Studies Association. Marika Broining is the past editor of the American Political Science Review, so you may have heard of them. And they are role theorists, and I've known them for a long time. But I was still surprised that they asked me to their workshop because at the time, I didn't do work on role theory. I knew of their research, but I wasn't a role theorist by any stretch. And then I figured out why they were asking me, and I asked, and they confirmed they needed me for gender balance. Right? And this happens, right? This has happened to me a lot throughout my career, especially early on when there are few women in political science, and particularly in international relations. And when I'm asked in an affirmative action setting like that, I just have to ask myself, is this good for me, right? Is this something I'm interested in doing anyway, regardless of why I am asked? So I've said no to some things because it felt too much like a stretch. And I almost said no to this, but I'm certainly glad I accepted their invitation. And so I said, yes, I'll be involved in the workshop. And then I asked my PhD student at the time, Christian Cantier, to help me read role theory research and to see if we had anything to say about it. And when we read it, we were really surprised that a lot of the research at that time assumed a unitary state, assumed that there was a domestic consensus on roles. But everything we know in foreign policy tells us that foreign policies are often contested. Why wouldn't their roles, their national roles, also be contested and debated at the internal level? Right? So Christian and I proposed a framework that established different sites of internal contestation, how, why roles would be debated internally, how it might affect the role playing by states. And then we applied it to Danish debates about its role in Iraq and Dutch debates about its role in Afghanistan. And then when in Scotland, Charlie was nice to say I jumped into the Scottish independence, but I think there was a little pushing that went with that. But what does this have to do with role theory? So Ryan and I and one of his students started working on the Scottish independence referendum as a case of role contestation. And it was really an interesting case because there were two different kinds of roles at play. One was, should Scotland be sovereign and play a sovereign role or not? To be or not to be a state, that is the question. Another one of my favorite titles of my work. The second role was, if it played a sovereign role, what kind of substantive foreign policy roles could it play? Right? Could it play the an EU member state role? Right? Would it be forced to play the role of a nuclear power with nuclear weapons still on its soil? Right? These were connected questions, the sovereignty role and the substantive role, but they were all part of the debate and were contested internally inside Scotland. And it was a rare case in which the public decided on the foreign policy role, rejecting, in this case, a sovereign role for Scotland. Usually role contestation is more in the domain of elites. So then Ryan and I wanted to look at the international reactions to Scottish independence. Because really, why would anyone, apart from the rest of the UK, care if Scotland became independent? But others did care, and they cared more when the polls got close and it looked like independence might be more possible. So we looked at this from a role theory perspective, with the yes side casting about for its roles, and external actors reacting to it, mainly opposing independence and the roles that it said it wanted to play, and in a sense socializing Scotland even before it was an independent state. So there's a lot of research in international politics on socialization of states with other states or international organizations to states, but we said this is happening in pre-statehood, right? Even before the agent here is a state, it's being kind of told what it's going to do if it becomes a state and whether it should become a state. And we argued that this socialization process revealed a connection, a nexus between sovereignty and roles in several ways. First, sovereignty was itself a role, and so the value of sovereignty, what would Scotland get with that in today's world, was challenged by outside actors. And sovereignty comes with the opportunity for other roles, such as neutral or faithful ally. And so some actors, international actors, were socializing Scotland or weighing into the debate by saying, you can't play this role, or you would have to play this role if you became sovereign. Third, since roles are relational, a sovereign role for Scotland would mean other roles might have to change. And this is one of the real advantages of role theory. It shows this relationship. So the UK's role in the world would be the main one here. And so others opposed Scottish independence because they worried what independent Scotland's role would have on what consequences that would have for the UK's roles that others counted on. So the US, for example, was very much against independence because it worried that it might compromise the UK's continued nuclear deterrent role. And finally, some worried about what Scottish sovereignty would mean for the broader role system. And Charlie and I were at Brookings the week before the referendum, and we heard a lot of angst about this. Would it unleash waves of nationalism? Would it cause the disintegration of the sovereign system? Would it have a balkanization effect? All of this was in play during the Scottish referendum. Scottish independence didn't happen. We thought, great, we've got that article, did that piece of research, done with that. And then, and then Brexit happened, the other side of the slide. And so Ryan and I, along with Kai Opperman, have been working on a paper that applies these ideas of the sovereignty role connection to both internal contestation with the UK over Brexit and external reactions. The UK is, of course, already a sovereign state, so it's not a pre-state socializing event. But Brexit was very much about sovereignty, take back control and getting more sovereignty in its foreign policy. And so the value of sovereignty was debated inside and outside the UK, and even the location of sovereignty, who gets the right to implement this new sovereign role change, Parliament, the courts, the government, or the public in the form of the referendum. And with the new independence, the UK has been casting about for multiple roles, leader of the Commonwealth, global Britain, and others are concerned about their own roles changing because of Brexit. So Ireland vis-a-vis Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, Netherlands losing its ally on many issues in the EU. And others see the opportunity to jump on the sovereignty bandwagon and revisit the UK's previous colonial roles by reasserting territorial claims. So Spain and Gibraltar, Mauritius and the Chagos Islands, Argentina and Malvinas. All of this has been part of the international reaction to Brexit. And there are broader concerns about the sovereign system again. Is Brexit, along with Trump's state-first view of sovereignty, a challenge to norms of cooperation and multilateralism and interdependence? Is it a threat to the European order or the liberal world order? Are we in a Brexistential crisis? So Brexit is a really good, really complicated case to explore this connection between sovereignty, which is a fundamental concept for international relations, and roles. So back to agency. As I said earlier, we can consider collectives like states and parliaments and parties as actors in their own right. But the stronger argument that I've made in my own research would be that it is still human agents that are the critical level of analysis. All the other stuff, roles, power, institutions, norms, constraints, opportunities, have to be funneled through the individual decision maker. They have to be interpreted. They have to be recognized or not. They have to be acted on or not by humans. And so it is their characteristics and their social dynamics and how these influence foreign policy that are the foundation of all of international relations. Because after all, everything that we're interested in, war, peace settlements, economic cooperation, human rights sanctions, they come from decisions that are made or not by individual decision makers. And so that's my research story tonight about the importance of individuals in international politics and also the importance of individuals in my own research. So as I said, it takes a village to raise an inaugural lecture, and here is my village. These are all my co-authors or co-editors or both. And I want to give a shout out to a few particular ones here. Barish and Christian, the guys at the top, you've seen them before in the slides. They were my PhD students, and they really show the power to me of co-authoring with your PhD students. They came into my life in the same foreign policy analysis seminar back in 2008, I think it was, and really gave me an intellectual jump start. And I didn't realize until the Distinguished Scholar panel that Charlie mentioned earlier that this is what had happened to me. I didn't know I needed it, but I really did. And without Barish, I wouldn't have started working on parliaments. Without Christian, I wouldn't have started working on role theory. So co-author with your PhD students, it's a win-win strategy. My village certainly includes my PhD students. I'm lucky to be part of their intellectual growth. And here's a recent picture of them in the middle, and they're kind of right there too. And I'm really proud of the network that they established on roles in foreign policy analysis. I also want to speak of my appreciation for knowing John Oberlander here on the left. Okay. I am fortunate to have had many meetings with John. I think Charlie first introduced us. Traveled together to present in Brussels and Oslo for work. Co-authored a conference paper with John and with Chad Damrow. And when I thought about my inaugural lecture, ever since I was promoted, I always imagined John would be here. He was very supportive of my ideas, especially on leader personality, and I look forward to working with him in the future. John passed away in December, and I was out of the country for his memorial here at the university. So I just wanted to say here how grateful I feel to have known him. He was incredibly enthusiastic, erudite, and enjoyable, and I really miss his presence. So life is precious, and I wanted to also acknowledge someone I think about as my perennial co-author in a sense for the last 11 years at least. This is Dr. Sherry Soul. She's my oncologist. And Dr. Soul took on my advanced case of breast cancer in the last hour before she was due to go on maternity leave. And she orchestrated my chemotherapy while on leave behind the scenes, and I'm standing here today because of her and a lot of luck. And then there's Ryan. He's my most frequent co-author, but he also gets medical credit. When I had the quad bike accident in Turkey, he used his prior medical training to assess me in the field, to direct the ambulance workers on what was most critical about my situation, and even started the oxygen on the bumpy ambulance road. So thanks for that. He plays many roles in my life, of course, and he, along with the kids, Ellie and Quinn, are part of my multi-party coalition. And this coalition has traveled with me during the journey of this research for sure, so figuratively traveled with me, but also literally traveled with me quite a bit. And these pictures of Ryan and the kids are from our recent research leave stay in South America. So they've traveled with me a lot for different jobs, for different research, for different conferences. And they've traveled with me to Scotland. Coming to the University of Edinburgh was a big decision, especially at my stage of life and my stage in the career, but it's clearly the best professional decision I've made. So I am pleased to deliver and now end this inaugural lecture. Thanks so much for listening.
She can't go yet, no. Julie, thank you. That was wonderful. I thought there were three wonderful things in it. One was that intellectual journey through those dimensions of agency, leadership, style, coalition decision-making, parliaments, parties, role, theory. And I was fascinated to see the interface between political science and social psychology in there. So a really fascinating journey. You also made very clear that it was a journey made possible by all sorts of other people. And you gave us a very clear summary of that at the end. But I noticed that right at the start when you were talking about Peg Herman, and it followed through to John Oberlander and others about what that said about your collaborative spirit, what you said about your collaborators, the generosity of your tribute says an awful lot about the depth of those relationships, and I think we could all see how important they have been to you, not least Ryan, who has a multifunctional role, I think. The final thing I wanted to reflect on was what you alluded to at the start. I think there's a much deeper story behind it, which you haven't fully given us. And that's somebody working in your field with an agency focused person in a structure-dominated field. And it's a really interesting field. I've been to the International Studies Association conference, which is the big convention, and when I dabbled in foreign policy, I was there mainly for anthropological purposes to understand this strange community, and there really is an intensity of debate there, which I have not seen at other conventions of academics, in which views are put and they are challenged, they are put under extraordinary scrutiny. And all of the big figures in the field go there, and they kind of slug it out. And I rather enjoyed watching all of that. And I think it's a fantastic thing for our school and for our university to have one of those big figures here in the form of Julie, and we've heard in this lecture why she is that. So thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you.